In 1853 Louisiana, when the very air itself became perilous. The sugar empire reigned at its height, and New Orleans glittered beneath chandeliers of reckless excess. Masquerade balls filled the night with music even as coffins rattled daily along its narrow streets. Cholera carried off thousands. Yellow fever took more. Yet, hidden among those plagues, another suffocation spread, one not born of water or insects, but of desire. Her name never appeared in the parish registers. No portrait was ever commissioned. And yet, every letter, every journal, every whispered rumor of that season described the same presence of woman whose fragrance lingered long after she departed. Admirers clutched her handkerchiefs to their lips, pressed her tokens against their hearts. Within days, they were buried. Doctors called it a collapse of the lungs. Families named it fever. The parish records called it nothing at all. But in a fragment of her diary, discovered decades later, her doctrine was written in a single chilling line: beauty must be inhaled, or it is nothing. She was adored, she was defended, and then she was erased. Only the dead she left behind remain, their names crossed through in the monotone of parish registers. Breath stolen, histories ended. This is the tale of the belle who served perfume as poison, who turned admiration into suffocation, whose beauty survived not in paintings or portraits, but in the air itself. Her victims were remembered. She was not. Perhaps that silence is why her legacy lingers. Subscribe to the 7th Mark to uncover more of history's most unsettling absences. And in the comments, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Let's see how far her perfume drifts. Louisiana in 1853 was a landscape of contradictions. The year's ledgers were swollen with sugar money, a commodity that bound New Orleans both to Europe's grand dining tables and to the parish's brutal labor fields. Ships unloaded molasses and barrels of rum beside the very docks where hearses waited for victims of cholera, the city's returning plague. That year alone, parish records recorded hundreds of deaths under the same line fever of the intestine's duration brief. Behind such language stretched a city where the scent of roses mingled with the acrid lime, spread across gutters in a desperate bid to cleanse. Still, the masquerade season carried on. New Orleans society prided itself on continuity, on keeping the parlors lit even as coffins were carried through the streets. Ballrooms with plastered walls and gilded ceilings pulsed with the music of imported quartets, even as physicians lamented that bodies decayed too quickly for proper burial. In the city's journals, 2 notations appeared side by side, advertisements for imported silks and perfumed oils, and obituaries for sons and daughters buried before their prime. Into this divided world, one young woman entered the record. Not in parish documents, but in fragments of private accounts and society columns. In a planter's journal from February that year, one entry noted, "The most striking presence at the St. Charles. Gathering not of wealth but of form." A clipping from the Daily Picayune described her simply as a belle newly arrived, captivating in her simplicity. Her anonymity sharpened her allure. Without lineage, without dowry, she seemed to move unchallenged through rooms ordinarily reserved for inheritance. Her beauty did not deny the presence of disease. It eclipsed it. Even as doctors issued notices warning of unexplained pulmonary failures folded into the statistics of cholera, observers recorded her presence at soirees, at masquerades, at private suppers. While the city coughed and buried, she danced and smiled. Tempting though it is to see this as defiance, the surviving fragments suggest something else calculation. One note later, attributed to a parish clerk who watched her at a masquerade, read, "She carried the air with her. Sugar fortunes framed her entrances. Wealth from the cane fields underrode the excess of that season. Parlors' perfumed gowns, layered in lace gloves, powdered with starch." The juxtaposition was stark. In the rural parishes, slave deaths went unmarked, mere tallies. In the city, death announcements were printed beside invitations to the next poll. The divide between the seen and unseen mirrored her own existence, celebrated openly, yet leaving no trace in official record. The cholera epidemic gave her cover. Parish registers, swollen with premature deaths, left little room for anomalies. Physicians overwhelmed listed collapse of the lungs as a frequent cause, tucked neatly among the pages of intestinal complaints, whether born of contaminated water or, as later whispers suggested, from something far more deliberate. The pattern folded seamlessly into the noise of disease. It is in this blurred line between epidemic and individual that her story begins. Historians often remark that 1853 marked the high watermark of Louisiana's sugar wealth just before the industry plateaued under political strain. Yet in the journals and letters that remain, another theme surfaces: a fixation on beauty as a fragile defense against death. Painted faces, scented gloves, handkerchiefs pressed to the lips, each gesture a small ritual of survival. She embodied this ritual to perfection. And while cholera choked the city, she left it breathless in another sense entirely. She entered New Orleans already suffocating, and she left it gasping in a different way. In the years following her arrival, she did not fade into the crowd. She ascended through it. Letters and journals from 1853 and 1854 record her appearances with growing frequency, though rarely by name. Instead, she emerges in descriptions. The radiant figure glimpsed in the corner of a hall. The belle new to our circles, yet commanding the dance floor, as if it belonged to her alone. Men wrote of her as though she were both spectacle and prize. Women wrote of her with tones that shifted uneasily between curiosity and resentment. Antebellum Louisiana revolved around appearances. Balls at the St. Charles Hotel or the French Opera House were less diversions than pageants of wealth. A woman's place within them was measured not by her voice, but by her presentation, her carriage, her dress, the subtlety of her charm. She seemed to possess these not as practiced skills, but as inevitabilities. Guests remembered her movements not as rehearsed gestures, but as instinct. Newspapers of the time, though indirect, lend weight to this impression. The Daily Picayune of January 1854 describes a young lady dazzling yet unostentatious who drew every gaze upon the balcony of masquerade. No name was printed, but when cross-referenced with private journals, the figure can only be traced back to her. Even as epidemics thinned households and parish registers expanded their columns of death, the society pages continued to praise the brilliance of the season's gatherings. And behind those glowing lines, her shadow lingers. Men pursued her openly. Several journals describe young planters requesting her for the quadrille soldiers in uniform approaching her with visible nervousness. Her refusal of some suitors only deepened the allure recorded in whispers as a woman who preferred silence to excess. Women meanwhile recorded her refinement with clipped edges. She wears nothing remarkable, yet the eye turns to her. Envy sharpened her image. Admiration softened it. The etiquette of courtship in the 1850s allowed women to exchange tokens, gloves, flowers, or handkerchiefs as discreet permissions for attention. She gave such tokens freely, but always perfumed. Admirers noted the trace of scent that clung to them long after the dance had ended. At the time, this was taken as a mark of intimacy. Only later would such traces be reconsidered, and yet, in the parish registers her presence is absent. Women of wealth were recorded in estate documents, their names attached to inheritances, property transfers, marriages. She appears in none of these. What remains of her is reputation alone, sustained entirely by observation and memory. It is as if her very existence relied on the words of others, on the breath required to describe her. Observers never explained her beauty. They only recorded its effects. Planters' sons described her as commanding without effort. One soldier's letter preserved in his regiment's papers called her a figure whose silence was eloquence. The absence of physical description is telling. Her beauty was never reduced to hair color or the shape of her face. It was atmospheric. It lived in candlelight gatherings where chandeliers doubled and tripled her reflection in mirrored walls. It spread through the ordered circles of dances where each partner passed briefly across her orbit, catching her scent. Her glance, the pull of her attention for a moment, and never forgetting it. Let us confirm that even the briefest encounter was enough to etch the memory of an entire evening. Her reputation as the belle of the season was secured not by wealth nor by lineage, but by this accumulation of impressions, a presence unrecorded in the archives, yet indelible in memory. She was carried in words, in descriptions, in breath itself. Her beauty was never written. It was inhaled. In the social grammar of the antebellum South, few tokens carried more weight than the handkerchief. It was the sanctioned bridge between admiration and intimacy, exchanged between men and women as discreet permission signals of favor or marks of remembrance. Handkerchiefs were pressed, embroidered, perfumed. To receive one was to be granted proximity that language alone could not permit. She understood this ritual better than most. Accounts suggest she carried several at every gathering, folded neatly, each touched with fragrance. Admirers noted the delicacy of the fabric, often lace-trimmed, always faintly warm from her hand. They were never passed casually, but with a pause, a glance, an implied promise. The recipients treated them as treasures. In journals, men confessed to pressing them against lips or chest, some even sleeping with them beneath pillows. One planter's son wrote, "Her favor rests against my heart. The fragrance lingers, and I am made restless." A soldier preparing to return to his regiment admitted he carried hers into the field, a charm against distance. The intimacy was physical, breathed in, absorbed, made part of the body. But the line between intimacy and invasion is perilously thin. Several of those who received her tokens soon developed sudden coughs. The descriptions recur a tightness in the chest, a burning in the throat, difficulty breathing. Families dismissed the timing as coincidence. Physicians overwhelmed in a season already thick with pulmonary complaints, made no distinction. Yet, the pattern, faint but undeniable, ran beneath the surface of polite silence. Arsenic was no stranger to the mid-19th century toilette. It appeared in powders, in dyes, even in soap. Its sweet, faintly bitter odor could be easily concealed beneath floral oils. Folded into fabric, its presence would not be advertised. Admiration and danger could be carried together, bound in linen, inhaled in trust. The etiquette of the time made such gifts unavoidable. A man who refused or discarded a woman's handkerchief risked insult. To press it to the lips to inhale its scent was expected behavior. The ritual demanded participation. The act of inhalation was both performance and submission. The first illnesses raised no suspicion. A planter's nephew, 22, died after a fortnight of coughing. The parish register listed respiratory collapse identical to dozens of others. His sister, in a private letter, wrote, "He carried her handkerchief always with him, breathing her gift until the end." Her words were meant as devotion, not accusation. Another case, a young merchant fell ill after a supper where she distributed tokens to 3 companions. Within a week, 2 were confined to their beds. Both deaths recorded simply as fever of the lungs. The handkerchiefs multiplied her influence. Unlike dance or conversation, they lingered after she departed. They carried her presence into bedrooms, carriages, even military camps. They were at once soft and suffocating tokens of charm that became instruments of disease. For those who received them, the distinction between favor and fate was imperceptible. Each gift was light folded linen, pressed with perfume, yet each bore consequence measured not in affection but in funerals. The gift was always light, yet it carried the weight of a coffin. In mid-19th century Louisiana, perfume was not indulgence. It was performance. Scent preceded a woman into the room, lingered after her departure, and filled the space where her name might never be spoken aloud. In parlors crowded with music and candlelight, where etiquette restricted speech and propriety, restrained touch fragrance became declaration. A way to be remembered without words, to leave impression without contact. Historical manuals of the era even instructed women in the art of scenting handkerchiefs, gloves, ribbons. Oils of lavender, rose, or bergamot were common. Imported musk or amber carried higher value. Recipes were precise distillations, tinctures, drops measured into glass vials. Yet beneath the delicacy lay darker inclusions. Arsenic, already notorious for its toxic sweetness, was used to whiten skin. Small doses gave the face a pale, luminous quality. Poison and beauty were already entangled. She mastered this entanglement. Witnesses described her not by features, but by atmosphere. She carried a fragrance that lingered after her departure. One planter's wife recorded her impression as half admiring, half uneasy. Another described her entrance at a masquerade as the arrival of air itself light and perfumed. These were not the words of rivals straining for detail. They were attempts to capture what could not be fixed in ink. Her presence was atmospheric, something inhaled rather than seen. Admiration in her case was always followed by unease. Fragrance was meant to be delicate, passing almost unnoticed. Yet hers clung. It filled corridors, attached itself to fabric, and refused to disperse. Letters from women remark on gowns that carried her perfume even after laundering. For some it was intoxicating, for others suffocating. The language of scent, lingering, clinging, refusing release, mirrored the symptoms later recorded by physicians. Tightness in the chest, difficulty breathing, collapse without wound. Perfume became her stage. The theatre of antebellum society demanded spectacle, elaborate gowns, choreographed dances, formal gestures. She surpassed these with something invisible. Where others relied on inheritance or costume, she required only the air. Each ball became her performance, each admirer her audience. Applause came not as clapping hands, but as bodies bent in pursuit suitors, carrying her tokens households, whispering her name. The danger was invisible as well. Contemporary records confirm arsenic compounds in perfumed powders. Undetectable to the untrained, these could irritate lungs, poison blood, and weaken breath. Women carried them in sachets, men in scented gloves. In her hands, such tools transformed from ornament to weapon. The line between fashion and mortality blurred. To inhale her presence was to risk suffocation disguised as admiration. Parish death registers of 1853 and 1854 record dozens of young men dead of respiratory collapse. None link her name. Yet journals confirm that many had been her companions at dances, recipients of her favors, participants in her theatre. Their names survive in death. Hers dissolves in silence. What remained was memory, air sweetened, then stifled. The recollections converge. She was unforgettable not in voice or gesture, but in the atmosphere she left behind. Admiration became indistinguishable from affliction. In her wake, the very air became suspect. The first traceable death came in late spring of 1853, at the close of the masquerade season. The parish register records James Dumplanter's son, aged 24. Cause respiratory failure. Duration of illness 3 days. Nothing in the entry suggests suspicion. The neatness of the clerk's hand, the brevity of the note speak only of another premature ending in a season already heavy with him. Yet, private accounts reveal more. James had been seen at the St. Charles Hotel ball the week before his decline, dancing repeatedly with a young woman described only as the belle of the room. A letter in his family papers notes that he returned home, flushed her fragrance clinging to his sleeve. Days later, his breath grew shallow. By the second day, he could no longer stand without collapsing. His physician wrote lungs congested yet without lesion. The failure is internal, unseen. At the time, such cases were attributed to swamp fever, a catch-all covering cholera, pneumonia, malarial complications. Terms like collapse of the lungs, suffocating fever, weakness of breath obscured more than they explained. James's death was folded into this vagueness, marked by uncertainty, but not alarm. The funeral was swift. Summer heat forbade delay. His coffin was sealed in the family vault, accompanied by a sermon on life's unpredictability. The minister's notes describe death as a thief, striking unseen the young as easily as the old. There was no mention of the ball, no mention of the fragrance he carried from it, but whispers moved differently than records. Guests recalled he had pressed one of her handkerchiefs to his lips. Years later, a woman remembered that he breathed her favor until his chest rattled. To those who observed him, devotion and illness had become indistinguishable. The object of admiration was inseparable from the process of decay. The Picayune obituary carried the standard formula of its time. Departed this life, James D., our beloved son and brother, taken in the bloom of youth. The restraint was deliberate. In an era where reputation carried more weight than cause, death was softened into euphemism, detached from detail. Parish silence was not neglect. It was policy. To name suspicion would be to implicate society itself, its rituals, its gatherings, its bells. James's passing marked the first recorded intersection of her presence and mortality, though no document drew the line. What survives is absence, no cause elaborated, no suspicion, voiced only the sterile phrase respiratory failure. Memory, however, retained what the record omitted. Accounts of the funeral mention mourners remarking on the faint sweetness in the air as the coffin was lowered. Perfume clung still to his clothing, drifting even into the chapel. No one named it. No one questioned why the room smelled sweet at a wake. Yet the impression remained beauty, lingering even in death. In the months after James's burial, parish registers thickened with similar entries. Different clerks, different hands, but the words, unchanged respiratory collapse. The phrase recurs like a refrain, smoothing anomaly into monotony. Edward B. 21. Failure of the breath, no lesion found. Samuel H. 23. Lungs weakened suddenly. Duration brief. By year's end, at least 6 young men from prominent families were laid in vaults beneath variations of the same words. Physicians offered little clarity. Surviving fragments of their notes describe illnesses that ended swiftly, often in days. Breath shortened, chest constricted, pulse shallow, post-mortem inconclusive. One doctor compared the sensation to lungs filled with glass dust. Another wrote, the organs appeared healthy, in structure failed in function. Observed, recorded, then abandoned. The medical lexicon of the time preferred ambiguity, collapsing suffocation into broad categories of fever or congestion. Gossip, however, moved differently. Households whispered that each of the dead had been recent admirers of the same figure, the belle whose fragrance lingered long after her departure. A planter's wife writing to her sister in Natchez remarked, the air about her is sweet, but those who breathe too deeply are soon lost. Cautious words veiled as metaphor yet heavy with implication. In parlors, whispers sharpened. The handkerchiefs she gifted, the scent that clung, the coincidence of sudden decline. Yet rumor never crossed into record. To accuse openly risked scandal, not only for her but for the families of the dead. Silence preserved reputations even as it erased truths. The archive reflects only that silence, the repetition of phrases, the careful avoidance of specificity. Respiratory collapse, failure of breath, never more, never less. The deaths narrowed to particular households, planters' sons, young merchants, soldiers on leave, men at the threshold of futures. Each had been seen with her. Each had carried her tokens. Letters from friends describe the devotion with which they pressed her perfumed gifts to lips and chest, inhaling favor as if it were privilege. The privilege was brief. Patterns are visible only in hindsight. At the time, cholera and fevers blurred mortality's landscape. Records already overflowed with premature deaths. To draw a line from one woman's presence to multiple suffocations required the kind of comparison no clerk or physician dared attempt. And so silence became institutional. Each case folded into the mass of unnamed disease as if repetition erased difference. Years later, when letters were reread and journals revisited, the names formed their own ledger. Young men who had danced with her, dined in her company, carried her scent. Their deaths explained by no epidemic, no household, no common affliction save her presence. The archive refuses to name her. The cause of death remains identical, each line echoing the last. Yet beneath the repetition lies another pattern, one not of illness, but of atmosphere. The disease was nameless. The perfume was not. The physicians of Louisiana in the 1850s were accustomed to death, but not to mystery. Their journals overflowed with shorthand cholera, morbus or bilious fever. Broad categories meant to account for collapse without explanation. Yet among the surviving fragments, another vocabulary emerges in the months after her ascent. One doctor attending James D. wrote, "Lungs constricted without visible cause. Patient gasps, no lesion, no effusion. Collapse, sudden, unprovoked." Another recording, the death of a young merchant in the French Quarter, compared the sensation to glass dust in the chest, impossible to expel. Their words betray unease. Diagnosis relied on familiar patterns, yet here, evidence refused conformity. Lungs intact, tissue unmarked. Function ceased while form remained. Post-mortem examinations offered little clarity. An autopsy in July 1853 described organs with no visible alteration. Patient nevertheless deceased in violent suffocation. The phrasing is clinical, yet its emptiness is haunting, reducing the body to paradox outwardly sound, inwardly ruined. Physicians dependent on visible signs found themselves unsettled. Several cases were attributed to miasma, the theory that poisonous airs rising from swamps and stagnant water could choke the living. Convenient in a city rife with refuse and disease. To blame, the air avoided deeper inquiry, folding anomaly into familiar superstition. Yet patients did not all live near marshes or canals. Their only common factor, whispered but never written, was proximity to her. Medical language reveals deliberate avoidance. Words like collapse, failure, and weakness recur, concealing the absence of cause. No physician dared suggest contagion, no household suffered as a whole. No one invoked poison, no residue was found, and her name never appeared. The silence was not ignorance, it was discretion. Doctors relied on metaphor to describe what they could not explain. One described a patient's final hours as breathing through cloth soaked in vinegar lungs, resisting each effort. Another likened it to a throat filled with the dust of mines. Analogies evoke suffocation, intrusion, violation. The betrayal of the most intimate act, drawing breath. The body betrayed by air itself became theatre for invisible violence. What unsettled doctors most was the speed. Cholera tore through bodies in a recognizable sequence, cramps purging collapse. Pneumonia clouded lungs with visible congestion. But these deaths arrived quietly, cough fatigue, then total collapse within hours. The familiar cadence of disease was absent, replaced by something abrupt, unnatural. Medical authority depends on naming. Diagnosis asserts control over uncertainty. Here, authority fractured. The silence of parish registers recording only respiratory collapse mirrored physicians' hesitation. To admit ignorance was destabilizing. To suspect foul play without proof was unthinkable. Better to blame the air, the season, the swamp. By the end of 1853, Several families had lost sons, nephews, or brothers under circumstances too alike to ignore. Each had been seen in her company. Each had carried her tokens. Each succumbed to the same suffocating decline. Yet none spoke against her. On the contrary, many defended her presence, insisting misfortune chose victims at random. In antebellum Louisiana, beauty was capital. It was protected with the same vigilance as property. Women of refinement, especially those who captured public imagination, were royally scrutinized. To suggest a belle as a source of danger was to question the rituals of society itself, the dance's courtship's theater of appearances. Accusation would implicate not just her but the very structure elevating beauty as untouchable. Silence therefore became preservation. Officials reflected this silence. Parish records, thick with deaths labeled respiratory collapse, remained unchanged. Clerks copied phrases mechanically. Probate courts handled estates heirs, deaths without mention of illness. Absence of inquiry was deliberate. The social machinery served continuity, not truth. Letters among prominent families revealed this shield at work. One planter's wife defended her against rumors. The poor girl suffers from jealousy, nothing more. Her charm cannot be blamed for the frailty of others. Another, after losing a nephew, insisted it was fever, not fragrance, that stole him. To speak otherwise wounds his memory. Grief was redirected away from suspicion. Preservation of her reputation outweighed any possibility of guilt. She herself remained untouched by loss. Reports describe her continuing to appear at gatherings, radiant, composed, her presence undiminished. If anything, tragedy deepened her allure. To some she seemed above misfortune, immune to the epidemic tides sweeping the city. To others she became a symbol of fascination, entwined with danger. Proximity to her was both privilege and risk, but no one dared articulate this in public record. Cultural obsession with female beauty reinforced the silence. Portraits, descriptions, and society columns circulated her image widely, yet she remained untouchable. The more she was admired, the less she could be accused. Newspapers continued to describe the lady who drew all eyes at masquerades, never naming her, never hinting at scandal. The press, like the parish, preferred ambiguity to disruption. The silence was not empty, it was complicit. Each repetition of respiratory collapse in the death registers, each vague obituary, each carefully neutral letter reinforced the same barrier. Behind it, she thrived, adored, defended, preserved. Like perfume in a sealed vial, her reputation remained untouchable. The pattern of deaths receded into background noise, drowned by the louder chorus of admiration. No accusation reached her. No official document recorded doubt. The whispers dissolved before they could stain the glass. Her beauty was not questioned. It was preserved like perfume, locked in glass. Her name did not endure in registers or ledgers. Parish clerks wrote only of the dead she left behind, never of her. Yet, decades later, in the dismantling of a Mississippi estate, a fragment surfaced that seemed to breathe her back into the record. The discovery was incidental. In the 1880s, an auction of household goods included a drawer of miscellaneous scraps of lace receipts for cotton shipments. Among them lay several loose pages written in elegant hand. The ink had browned edges brittle, yet the script remained legible. Now housed in a regional archive, the fragment preserves little narrative, no dates, no places, no names. What it preserves instead is a philosophy. The most striking line circled by later archivists in pencil reads, Beauty must be inhaled or it is nothing. The words are simple and devastating. They reduce beauty from sight to breath, from admiration to ingestion. To be admired at a distance was insufficient. Beauty existed only when drawn inside, when it entered another body, consumed as it consumed. The vanity is not decorative, it is doctrinal. Handwriting analysis confirms the script belongs to a woman educated in refined penmanship. Slanted, consistent letters, deliberate, flourishes, nothing hurried. Each word composed with the confidence of being read, even if the audience was only herself. Ink formulations correspond to mid-century recipes, though provenance cannot be traced absolutely. Timing, style, and content narrow the possibilities. Other lines in the fragment are equally revealing. To linger is to remain. An air is possession. Not diary confessions in the usual sense, but aphorisms, rules, guiding principles. They suggest a woman who conceived beauty, not as attribute, but as force demanding contact, permanence, inhalation. Context from the period reinforces the strangeness. 19th century treatises framed beauty as moral. Elegance reflected inner virtue. Pale skin, modest scent. Graceful movement, signs of discipline, not predation. Her fragment reverses this instruction. Beauty for her was not virtue performed. It was demand made. To be inhaled was not a metaphor but an imperative. Archivists noted the unsettling resonance with parish registers of 1853-1854. Without claiming causality, they underlined the coincidence, a doctrine of inhalation beside a cluster of deaths by respiratory collapse. The fragment survives against the odds. Most diaries were destroyed by decay or deliberate erasure. These pages endured, detached, hidden in a drawer. Their survival feels accidental, intrusive, as if the words themselves resisted erasure. Admiration was once safe, confined to sight, description word. Here admiration became consumption, demanded through breath, the most vulnerable act of the body. For her, admiration alone was never enough. Breath itself was tribute. Among surviving recollections, one event recurs: the supper she hosted in spring 1854. A small gathering, remembered not for conversation but aftermath. Parish records are silent. No official note of what followed, yet memory fills the gaps. Accounts describe a dozen guests, all from respectable families, dining by candlelight. The meal was ordinary: poultry, rice, imported wine. What lingered was atmosphere, thick, perfumed beyond reason, clinging to cloth and silverware. Guests left, weakened, coughing before night's end. 2 young men, admirers of hers, died within days. Parish ledgers list respiratory collapse the supper never noted. Families recalled clothes saturated with fragrance as if poison had soaked into the fabric. Servants later claimed the tablecloth retained the odor of bitter almonds, a trace associated even then with arsenic. Testimonies contradict on her behavior. Some said she ate nothing, moving among guests with quiet composure. Others insisted she dined heartily, a display of vitality, while others sickened. The effect was the same: her presence lingered, invisible, intoxicating, and deadly. The contradiction is telling. Witnesses searched for signs that distinguished her from the fate she dealt, but none agreed. What they remembered most consistently was the fragrance, sweet, heavy, suffocating. Her use of gatherings as cover fits the pattern. Social meals were stages where status was confirmed, alliances strengthened, reputations maintained. To invite was to honor, to attend was to be counted. By embedding herself in these rituals, she made suspicion impossible. No one accused the hand that offered hospitality, even when the gift ended in funerals. The supper table, like her handkerchiefs, became an instrument of inhalation. The silence of records contrasts sharply with the persistence of rumor. Parish registers repeated their monotone of respiratory collapse. Newspapers carried obituaries with softened language. Departed in youth beloved lamented. The supper itself is absent from official accounts. Only memory survives the air, too heavy, too perfumed, impossible to forget. Historians note that arsenic, when burned in lamps or mingled with heated oils, released a faintly almond-like scent. In small doses, it irritated lungs, producing cough and fatigue. In greater measure, it suffocated. Whether she understood this scientifically or intuitively is uncertain. What is clear, her guests inhaled what could not be refused. The supper remains emblematic, not for uniqueness, but for memory. Oral testimony, though contradictory, carries unease across decades. To dine in her company was to breathe her world, to carry her presence into the body. What was served that night was not food, it was fragrance. By 1855, the trail ends. Her presence, once echoed in journals, whispered in letters, carried in parish. Rumor dissolves from the record. In registers where every woman of note appears through marriage licenses, burial entries, or estate transfers, her name is conspicuously absent. The silence is deliberate. Parish ledgers of the mid-19th century followed strict order. Columns recorded predictable transactions, baptisms, marriages, deaths, sales of property and persons. Pages moved in rhythm, names stacked neatly line after line. Against this monotony, her disappearance is striking. She should appear documented as a wife, a widow, or at the very least, one more burial in a year, crowded with funerals. Instead, the spaces where her name might have been remain filled only by others. The archive itself averts its eyes. Clerks were not careless. Surviving registers demonstrate precision bordering on obsession. They recorded stillbirths, unnamed infants, even transient workers claimed by disease. Yet for her there is nothing. No death entry, no marriage, no property transaction. Her absence is too complete to be accidental. Historians offer two explanations. First, protection. Families of influence may have shielded her from association. Reputation once shattered could fracture entire lineages. To preserve their own, they erased hers. Second, punishment. Parish officials, unwilling to record scandal, but unable to charge her, may have denied her inscription as a form of quiet condemnation. The effect is the same. She lingers only in gaps. Where others are accounted for, she is not. The void becomes evidence. Private correspondence continues beyond 1855, always in past tense. Letters that once described her presence at balls now refer to that lady who vanished. A planter's daughter wrote, "No license, no obituary. She has been folded away as though never here." Others invoked her as a cautionary figure mentioned, but never detailed, as if repetition might summon her back. The disappearance contrasts sharply with the persistence of her victims in the record. Their deaths remain inscribed, monotonous but undeniable respiratory collapse. Men are buried, estates, settled names preserved in probate. She is not. The imbalance is plain. Rows of men carried to the ground and no trace of the woman who walked among them. To study the ledgers is to feel the weight of this silence. Pages turn steadily, each filled with life, reduced to entries, numbers, names, causes. Then comes the realization, what is missing is as deliberate as what is present. Her absence is architecture, a blank space built into the record like a sealed chamber. In the archive, she is missing. In the ground, others are not. Where parish ledgers reduce the dead to inked lines, the letters of their families restore what records denied. Grief, bewilderment, and silence shaped into words. Scattered through New Orleans and Natchez archives are fragments of correspondence from mother sisters and uncles of men who died after breathing her in. None name her directly, yet, between the lines, lies her shadow. One letter preserved among the Biward family papers laments the loss of a son not yet 22. He departed without struggle of the body, only the breath failing as if taken by the air itself. The phrasing avoids disease, avoids diagnosis. It registers only manner of ending breath, withdrawn life, folded in upon itself. The writer does not accuse, yet the absence of explanation resonates like a mission carved deliberately into stone. One letter, dated 1854, records a mother's confusion at the rapid decline of her son. Well, on Thursday, weakened by Friday and by Sunday, unable to draw enough air to speak. Her description echoes physician notes of the time, yet carries intimacy beyond medical detail. She writes not as observer, but as witness, the last to hear his unfinished words. Still, she does not name suspicion. Pain is folded into the rituals of mourning. The letter ends with the request for black crepe ribbon to be sent from New Orleans. In antebellum, Louisiana etiquette dictated restraint. Grief was signaled through clothing veils, gloves, or withdrawn invitations. To speak plainly, to suggest irregularity or scandal, risked attention not only to the dead, but to the family's standing. Silence was safer. Silence preserved honor. The letters are cautious. They describe breathless deaths weakening without fever or chest collapse. None point to her. At most, one sister wrote bitterly, "He was too eager to please, and the favor he carried pleased him into the grave." The phrasing circles around the token perfumed, inhaled, but never names the giver. To accuse would have been to confess intimacy, to admit her presence into the family parlor, even their trust. The cost of preserving her reputation was borne by these families. Sons were buried with ceremony obituaries, softened, taken in youth, beloved by all. The absence of cause in public records mirrored the guarded tone of private grief. To name her was to admit complicity. Historians note that grief in these letters rarely moved beyond description into inquiry. Ritual replaced explanation, swift funerals, mourning clothes ordered from Europe, portraits draped in black. The archive's silence is mirrored in the silence of the heart. Yet, between the lines, the pattern survives. Breathless deaths collapses without fever or lesion. Young men seen in her company, weeks before, written carefully, mourned quietly, their stories constrained by etiquette. By the mid-1850s, Louisiana's ledgers resembled a city drowning in contagion. Parish registers from 1853 and 1854 teem with premature deaths, each line stamped with phrases so routine they might have been mechanized: respiratory collapse, failure of the breath, weakness of the lungs. Cholera and yellow fever appear in heavy numbers alongside these entries, providing a ready language for loss. Any death that could not be explained was absorbed into the shadow of epidemic. The statistics conceal more than they reveal. In the summer of 1853 alone, New Orleans recorded nearly 8,000 cholera deaths, entire blocks of names bracketed under the same diagnosis. Yellow fever followed thinning households and emptying plantation affairs. The repetition hardened into alibi. When young men suffocated after evenings in her company, their collapse was folded neatly into the litany of disease. Doctors did not challenge this. One 1854 report notes, "The city remains afflicted with multiple pulmonary disorders, some resembling swamp fever, others epidemic congestion." Vague final. Physicians lacked incentive to separate anomaly from epidemic. Their notes reflected the climate, not the individual. To distinguish her victims from those felled by fever would have required admitting that beauty itself had become contagion. Parish registers show the blindness clearly. Her admirers are listed alongside laborers, immigrants, children, all claimed by collapse of the lungs. Uniformity erases distinction, binding the privileged to the anonymous. Her pattern of deaths masqueraded as part of a larger catastrophe. Families leaned on this cover. Obituaries cited fever letters spoke of common scourge epidemic misfortune. To frame deaths otherwise would have exposed intimacy as cause. Even later, the conflation persisted. Historians reading parish registers see only the density of premature death, the bureaucratic monotony of illness. Yet, within the lines lies a secondary epidemic, one of desire, proximity, inhalation. Her victims did not share households' wells or neighborhoods. Their common link was her. What was epidemic in truth was admiration. The desire to draw near, to breathe what lingered in her wake, created a contagion of its own. Inhalation was both devotion and demise. The city, blinded by its own plagues, could not distinguish between fevers of the body and fevers of attraction. The archive conceals her beneath the very illnesses that shielded her. Cholera and yellow fever are recorded in bold numbers. Her hand, if it was there, is invisible, hidden in plain sight among thousands. The deaths she carried are misattributed, misfiled, mislabeled, preserved only in whispers that pierced ritual silence. They thought it was fever. It was perfume. Her last sighting is unrecorded in parish registers or newspapers, surviving only in memory, repeated in letters and oral tradition like a tale that clings long after paper has turned brittle. It was a masquerade in 1855 in one of New Orleans' grand halls. Accounts agree on little except that she was there and that she did not appear again. Masquerades were spectacles of anonymity, masks of velvet or porcelain identities blurred beneath feathers and jewels. They were rituals of license in a society otherwise bound by etiquette, nights where whispers and glances passed without consequence. The chandeliers cast fractured light, the air thick with smoke, perfume, and sweat. She moved most freely here. Witnesses remembered her not for costume, but for presence. One described her mask as white, unadorned, as though absence itself was ornament. Another claimed black feathers indistinguishable among the crowd. Contradictions reflect the nature of memory when identity is concealed. Wherever she moved, men followed. She danced until dawn, partners circling through quadrilles and waltzes, each marked by her fragrance. The ballroom itself seemed to thicken where she passed. 3 young men admirers all collapsed within days, recorded with the same weary phrases: respiratory failure, weakness of the lungs. The ball was never mentioned. Her presence left no trace in parish registers. Yet among attendees, the connection was clear. Letters mention the deaths obliquely. The favor of her dance seems not without cost. 3 followed her too closely and none remain. Her name was absent. Etiquette extended even to the edge of recognition. After that night, No surviving record notes her no obituary marriage license or property transfer. The masquerade is her last documented presence, though surviving only in rumor and recollection. She dissolved with the dawn. Historians find little beyond contradictions. Some place the ball in the French Opera House, others in a private riverside ballroom. Some insist her final dance was with a soldier, others with a planter's heir. What remains consistent is finality. She appeared. She lingered. She vanished. Absence in the record mirrors, absence in breath. Just as her victims collapsed without visible cause, her disappearance left no trace. The city moved on ledgers, recording baptisms, marriages, deaths in monotone. Only memory suspended her in that final dance, immortalized in suffocating air. She left no name, grave, or portrait. Only ledgers of others remained, rows of young men carried into burial under the same refrain, respiratory collapse. Identical lines strip individuality, filing them into silence. Parish clerks recorded each passing with practiced efficiency, no annotation, no speculation, no link drawn between cases. Her absence is refusal, not ignorance. Never in marriage columns, death entries, or probate records. The ledger preserves only consequences, never presence. Her figure is traced from silence rather than inscription. Historians note the imbalance. Pattern emerges when fatalities are aligned, yet the archive insists on erasure. To write her name would be to admit complicity, that beauty carried too close could suffocate. Easier to blame fever epidemic or poisoned air. Easier to preserve her in glass than stain her with ink. Her diary fragment provides her only direct voice. Beauty must be inhaled or it is nothing. The line stands like an epitaph denied. It captures her philosophy and the paradox of her survival. She exists not in parish words, but in the lungs of those who drew her in their collapse, the only testimony that endures. Silence of the record becomes haunting itself. Each appearance of respiratory collapse carries more than disease. It is cipher placeholder, a surrogate for her absent name. Across pages, households, years, the phrase recurs. She is not named yet inscribed in suffocation. By the close of 1855 entries, thin. Epidemic seasons waned, her trail dissolved into ordinary deaths. The archive resumes rhythm, baptisms, marriages, sales, inheritances, all in steady lines. Her silence folds into the cities indistinguishable from thousands of others erased by time. What lingers is atmosphere, recollection, rumor. Letters of breathless deaths, a tablecloth smelling faintly of bitter almonds, a diary fragment preserved by accident. Her beauty did not survive in portrait or biography, it survived in suffocation. To the archive, she is blank. To memory, she is inhalation. To history, she is both. To be admired was not enough. To be inhaled was eternal. Her name never appeared. Her death was never recorded. Her legacy survives only in the breathless collapse of those who drew too near. The archive preserved her victims in neat lines of ink. Sons, heirs, admirers, all the same refrain, respiratory failure. She remains absent, erased. But in that absence, her presence is clearer than ink. Beauty inhaled, and fatal left no portrait, only silence thick with perfume. To be admired was not enough. To be inhaled was eternal. If you found this story unsettling, subscribe to the 7th Mark. Here we uncover the shadows. History tried to erase forgotten deaths, erased names and silences that still breathe. Leave a comment with your country and the time you're watching. Let's see how far these forgotten stories travel. Because history does not always whisper. Sometimes it suffocates.